Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Welcome, all of you, tonight, and we're so glad you joined us. YIVO, at its core, is a library and an archive. We have over 400,000 books in our collection and over 23 million documents. And researchers and students, musicians, journalists from all around the world come to use our collections to do their work. And we make these collections also available through classes, exhibitions, and public programs. So tonight, we're very lucky to be presenting a new book, which was largely researched in our collection, on anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution. We're very happy to have Brendan McKeever and a slew of really amazing scholars here to discuss this book. And I'm going to just hand it over to Jack Jacobs, who is going to be the MC for the evening. Jack Jacobs is a professor of political science at John Jay College in the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He's the author of On Socialists and the Jewish Question After Marx, Bundes Counterculture in Interwar Poland, and the Frankfurt School, Jewish Lives and Anti-Semitism. And he's the editor of Jewish Politics in Eastern Europe, the Bund at 100, and of Jews and Leftist Politics, Judaism, Israel, Anti-Semitism, and Gender. He served as a Fulbright Fellow at Tel Aviv University 1996 to 1997, and as a Fulbright Fellow at the Vilnius Yiddish Institute in 2009, as a Padnos Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan in 2016, and as a Visiting Fellow of the British Academy in 2018. Jack Jacobs is a very amazing scholar and someone we've worked with a lot at YIVO, notably on a recent panel about the influence of the Jewish Bund, Labor Bund in politics today very recently, and also on a big conference about Jews and the left, which turned into an edited volume that he was the editor of. So we're really thrilled to welcome Jack Jacobs to the stage to take the lead for tonight. Jack? Oh, and please, yeah. And I'll also take this moment to invite all of the panelists speaking who Jack will introduce. Jack.
Thank you, Alex, and my thanks to the YIVO for hosting this event. Dr. Brendan McKeever is lecturer in sociology at Birkbeck, University of London. He's based at the Pearce Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck, and he teaches in Birkbeck's Department of Psychosocial Studies. Brendan is a 2019 BBC Arts and Humanities Research Council New Generation thinker, and has had his work featured on British radio and television programs lots and lots of times. The American edition of his first book, Anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution, the publication of which is the reason for our gathering this evening, will be officially issued by Cambridge University Press next week. Brendan's splendid book, based on extensive research in Russian and Ukrainian archives, and exceptionally well-written, examines, among other matters, both the participation by components or members of the Red Guards and the Red Army in anti-Semitic violence, and attempts by Bolsheviks to confront anti-Semitism within their own ranks and in the society in which they worked. He sheds particularly great light on the roles played by Jewish socialists, some of whom entered the Soviet regime and brought into that regime pre-existing perspectives on anti-Semitism and, of course, on other matters. Brendan argues, with reference to these individuals, that the closer they had stood to what he calls a Jewish socialist national project in the pre-revolutionary era, the greater the likelihood that they would underscore the necessity of confronting anti-Semitism in the revolutionary context. For specific leading members or one-time members of Jewish socialist parties, anti-Semitic violence became the fundamental issue at a crucial moment in the era of the Bolshevik Revolution. But for the central leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the fundamental issue at that same moment in time was not pogroms, but rather the survival of the revolutionary project itself. There was, therefore, a crucial distinction with regard to anti-Semitism between the outlook of non-Jewish Bolshevik leaders on the one hand and Jewish communists with prior histories in Jewish socialist parties on the other, a distinction which helps to illuminate the overarching Soviet response to anti-Semitism per se. Brendan's argument is persuasive, and it's likely also provocative. Brendan will present his book in just a moment or two, and then following Brendan's presentation, we'll hear comments from a very distinguished panel of experts. So please allow me to introduce them at this time in the order in which they will be speaking. Andrew Sloan. Andrew, please raise your hand. Thank you so much. Is Associate Professor of History at Baruch College, City University of New York. His book, The Jewish Revolution in Belarusia, Economy, Race, and Bolshevik Power, published by Indiana University Press in 2017, received the Dorothy Rosenberg Prize from the American Historical Association. His current book project is entitled Troubled Time, Socialism and the Yiddish Historical Imagination, 1871 to 1948. He's a member during the academic year 2019-2020 of the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Polly Zavadivka. Polly, please raise your hand. It makes it easier. Polly is Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Program in Jewish Studies at the University of Delaware. She's the editor and translator of Shin Ansky's 1915 diary, a Russian Jewish writer at the Eastern Front, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2016, and most recently of an article entitled Contending with Horror, Jewish Aid Work During the Russian Civil War Pogroms, which appeared this year in Quest, Issues in Contemporary Jewish History. She's currently working on a book manuscript, Experiments in Catastrophe, Russia's First World War and the Jews. Jonathan Brent, who scarcely needs an introduction here, has been executive director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research since 2009. From 1991 until 2009, he was editorial director at Yale University Press, where he established the Annals of Communism series. His books include Stalin's Last Crime, published in 2003, and Inside the Stalin Archives, published in 2008. He has translated poems of Brodsky and Mayakovsky and has taught both history and literature at Bard College. He's currently working on a novel and on a biographical study of the Russian writer Isaac Babel. And now, at long last, Dr. McGeever, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So, thank you, Jack. Wow. Thank you to YIVO, to Jonathan Brent, to Alex for hosting me this evening, and thanks also to Jack and Polly and Andrew too. Really, just what a tremendous honor this is for me to be here at the YIVO, no less, a place such as this, before an audience such as this, sharing a panel with people whose work has been absolutely formative to me since I've been a graduate student and when I started thinking about these issues. So really, thank you to all of you for taking part. As Jack's already said, this is a book that tries to get to grips with a chapter in the history of anti-Semitism and the left. And above all else, it's concerned with a question. How did the left, the revolutionary left, respond to anti-Semitism when the issue reared its head within the movement itself? Now, when I was on the plane coming over from the UK thinking about this, I was reminding myself and thinking back to 10 years ago, to 2009, when I was starting this project at the University of Glasgow as a first-year PhD student. And really what I had to grapple with back then was just the indifference that my fellow PhD colleagues had about this subject. Anti-Semitism, the left, the Russian Revolution, why would anyone be interested in that? I was in a sociology department, by the way. And that's what I came up against all the time. Now I've got a different problem. In the UK, everyone's completely exhausted by the subject of anti-Semitism on the left, and nobody wants to hear about it anymore. So it's interesting to reflect on the moment we're in now and how things have changed over the last decade in which I've been grappling with this subject. But I want to begin not in Brexit Britain, not in 2019, but in 1919, in Rasava, a village in the Kiev province a century ago. I want to begin with a Jewish socialist named Ilya Smulevich, who's just been arrested by a member of the local Bolshevik government, along with 6 other Jews, for no other reason than their being Jewish. And I want to read you his testimony of this experience. It's a little long, but it goes right, I think, to the heart of the matter. They loaded the revolvers. Sensing the inevitability of death, I spluttered out, "I'm a poor worker. I'm a Bolshevik." The passion of my trembling voice seemed to soften up the menacing Red Army commander, who agreed to grant us the temporary right to live, subject to approval by the Commissar. Before adding poisonously, "I may be your brother, but I don't trust you Jews. There's too many of you among us." The Commissar ordered us to be shot on the spot. One of the condemned, Podolsky, for some reason kept his hands deep within his pockets throughout the whole affair, refusing to take them out. Thrown into a rage by this refusal to follow orders, the Commissar took out his saber and struck Podolsky on the head several times. The blows were so hard, his skull split open, his brains spilled onto the floor. My death now seemed inevitable. I began frantically restating my commitment to the Bolsheviks, to the working class, and to its liberation. And to my great fortune, one of the guards shouted, "Okay, send this Yid to court instead." I walked away and I heard the sound of gunshots. My fellow comrades had fallen. I was taken back to the Commissar. He pushed me up against the wall, put the revolver to my head. "Are you a Jew?" he asked. I replied, "I am not a Jew. I'm a soldier of the revolution, a soldier of labor." "Very well, off you go," he said. I was free. At the first checkpoint, I was stopped by a Red Army soldier. He asked me, "What's your nationality?" I answered, with a phrase now filled with happiness, "I am a soldier of revolution, a soldier of labor." The Red Army officer replied, "I too am an internationalist, but I want to know, are you a Jew or not?" I answered, "For an internationalist, it makes no sense to ask what nationality one belongs to." The soldier, waving his hand as if to get rid of a bad smell, said, "Very well, off you go." That's the end of the passage. Now, in much of the existing literature on the Russian Revolution, anti-Semitism is presented as counter-revolution, as the preserve of the anti-Bolshevik political right, and with good reason. The Tsarist regime, as we know, was defined in many ways by its anti-Semitism, and the Bolshevik leadership opposed anti-Jewish violence. Yet this is not the full story. As the rather shocking example of Comrade Shmulevich, which I just read out, testifies, anti-Semitism traversed the political divide in revolutionary Russia, finding traction across all political formations. For the Bolsheviks at the time, and in fact for generations of Marxists ever since, racism and revolutionary politics are framed in contestation. But in the Russian Revolution, anti-Semitism and class politics could be overlapping as well as competing worldviews. And this is what I tried to come to terms with in the book. Because when the Bolsheviks came to power in October 1917, as we know, they announced the overthrow of a world that was scarred, still is scarred, by exploitation and domination. Driven really first and foremost by a quite unprecedented mobilization of class injuries, the revolution also offered deliverance from the injustices of gendered and racialized domination as well. And it was that promise of a world free of racism, in particular, that resonated far and wide, reaching a really quite truly global audience. And it is captured, that sense, quite powerfully in the writings of the Jamaican-American black writer Claude McKay, who in 1922, by the way, went to Moscow to take part in the 4th Congress of the Communist International. And here he is speaking on the podium in the Kremlin with Clara Zetkin and Karl Radek and others behind him. Now, what's interesting about McKay, many things are interesting about him, but one thing for this evening's discussion is particularly interesting, is that he and his interest in the Bolshevik project stemmed from his understanding of the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism. This is what he wrote in September 1919. Bolshevism has made Russia safe for the Jew. It might make the United States safe for the Negro. If the Russian idea will take hold of the white masses of the West, black toilers will automatically be free. I just absolutely love this quote, and I insert it into every single talk I ever give, regardless of the subject. But it works quite well tonight, hopefully, or it at least fits the topic. I mean, it brings together, doesn't it, an opposition to anti-Semitism within the politics of the Black Atlantic. So it's a multi-directional anti-racism, if you will. But as he's putting pen to paper in September 1919, the most explosive wave of anti-Jewish violence storms through the Pale of Settlement. And what we're talking about here, as I'm sure many in this audience will know, is the most significant assault, most violent assault in Jewish life in pre-Holocaust modern history. The most conservative estimates put the figure of those murdered at roughly 40,000, but the number, and actually Soviet politicians at the time estimated that as many as 200,000 had been murdered. And we will never know the true figure, but certainly around 100,000 Jews lost their lives, and many, many more were bereaved and orphaned and suffered all sorts of connected consequences. So here we have this moment, this revolution, this moment of emancipation and of liberation that for many Jews is defined and accompanied by racialized violence on a really quite unprecedented scale. And what was shocking for the Bolshevik leadership was the participation of the Red Army in this violence. So workers, peasants, Red Army soldiers, mobilized by the Bolshevik project, mobilized to express their class injuries, had turned on Jews. And this was the task I set myself as I sat down to write this book. Why was it that the project of class justice, of social justice, could sometimes take an anti-Semitic turn? Why was the question of anti-Semitism so explosive for Bolshevism? Why could it, in some contexts, overlap with revolutionary politics? That's one thing that the book tries to get to grips with, but there's another set of questions that it tries to tackle as well. What on earth did the Bolsheviks do about this? How was the question of anti-Semitism within the working class handled, conceptually, theoretically, and politically? And not just how, but who? Who crafted the Bolshevik response to this extraordinary violence? So what I'm going to try and do, basically, in the time I have, is tell you what I found and tell you what I think about those questions. But before I do that, I think it's really important for us to bear in mind that the Red Army was not the only source of pogromist violence in the context of the Russian Revolution. Far from it. In his classic study, still classic study, carried out in the interwar years, the YIVO and Yiddish scholar Gergel calculated that the vast bulk of pogroms were indeed carried out by anti-Bolshevik political formations, those formations of the political right. I'm not sure how visible this is, maybe not visible at all, so I'll just talk you through it for a minute. On the right side of the screen, you can see, hopefully, that Gergel calculated that 8.6% of the pogroms that he was aware of were carried out by the Red Army. Much higher numbers were carried out by the Petlura and Denikin military formations, 40% and 17% respectively. So in the book, what I do is take that figure, 8.6%. It's actually more than that. It's closer to 1 in 10. But I take that figure and place it center stage, not because of the numerical significance in the overarching pogrom wave, but rather because of the absolutely fundamental question that those pogroms posed of the Bolshevik project and of its anti-racist promise. Because Red Army anti-Semitism radically undermined the Marxist and Bolshevik theorization of what anti-Semitism was. That is to say, when the Bolsheviks responded to anti-Semitism, and they did respond to it, they were responding to an anti-Semitism that had found traction deep within the movement's social base. And actually, the very first pogroms to break out after the October Revolution, and this is significant, were pogroms carried out by the Red Army in the Ukrainian northeast in the spring of 1918. And we can talk a bit about that in the discussion afterwards if you want to hear about that violence. But this was all a precursor to the much more profound and serious violence that took place in the spring and summer of 1919 after the Bolsheviks had come to power once more in Ukraine. And what I did for this book was to sit in the party archives in Moscow and Kiev and to really go through systematically the svodki, as they're known in Russian, the military reports that are sent to Lenin, sent to Trotsky, sent to the Central Committee, 2-3 times a week, reporting on the moods of the Red Army, the kind of slogans that the Red Army were coming up with, and the types of political action that they were engaged with. Now, I've gone through every single one of these reports for the year 1919, and what you see when you go through them is that anti-Semitism was strongly developed within the Red Army in every single province of Ukraine where the Red Army was stationed in that year. In fact, the situation was so profound and so grave that in some regions, Bolshevik agitators could not even go near their own Red Army for fear, to talk about anti-Semitism, for fear of being shot on the spot as Yid speculators, is one of the phrases that comes up time and again. Political work in the Red Army is entirely impossible, says one report into the Soviet First Army, because anti-Semitism is so strongly developed. Pogroms have become an everyday occurrence. And as you sit through this material, what you see is that one of the most popular slogans of the Red Army in these regions in that year of 1919 is "Smash the Yids, long live Soviet power." So what you see very quickly is that the lines of demarcation between revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, internationalist, and anti-Semite, lines of demarcation that were absolutely clear in the minds of the Bolshevik leadership, on the ground, on the actuality of the social field, were categories that were actually fluid and porous. So I sat in the archives and asked myself the question, what is this all about? What drives this anti-Semitism on the revolutionary left? What are the historical, cultural, and social conditions that enable this extraordinary confluence between the seemingly antithetical camps of revolution and counter-revolution? Now, any set of answers to that question has to be many-sided. There's no straightforward explanation of pogromist violence. There's local factors, national factors, and international dimensions to it as well. But one thing that I came away from my research on this subject and tried to make this argument in the book is that what animates Red anti-Semitism in this moment is the confluence between anti-Semitism and class politics, between, in particular, the politics of race and class. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, in Ukraine in particular, but beyond as well, many within the Bolshevik social base fought for a populist conception of Soviet power, a power of the people, a power of the laboring people. Against whom? Against the capitalists, the speculators, the exploiters. And these are standard categories of revolutionary Bolshevism. And as far as the Bolshevik leadership was concerned, they were precisely the kinds of categories that would cut through the politics of nationality and show the way to class liberation. But on the ground, in the Russian revolutionary conjuncture, and in Ukraine in particular, again, these standard categories of class struggle on the ground were really understood in profoundly racialized dimensions. Indeed, the very words themselves, Ukrainian, Jew, simultaneously bore both class and ethnic overdeterminations. So in the popular imaginary, the Ukrainian as a category, well, who is the Ukrainian in this moment? It's a true worker, an honest worker, a toiler, you know, the kind of person that's got dirt underneath their fingernails. That kind of worker. Puts their hands to productive labor, concrete labor. And who is the Jew in the popular imaginary in this moment? Well, a non-laborer, to be sure, a speculator, perhaps, an extractor of surplus value, not a producer of it. Again, I'm talking about the imaginary here, not necessarily social relations as they are. So the Ukrainian worker or peasant has an organic relationship to the land, to the people, to the nation, or indeed to the revolution, unlike the Jew. So the very categories that the Bolshevik leaders reserved for class analysis meant something different on the ground as they played out on the political field. And revolutionary discourse, therefore, and anti-Semitic representations of Jewishness were not distinct from one another. Often, they moved in and out of each other. And by the way, actually, class relations themselves played a role in providing the foil for this. In Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians, if we can use that term, and I absolutely detest that term, but we use it just for now, ethnic Ukrainians constituted 80% of the total population of Ukraine, just 4% of the industrial working class. In contrast, they comprised 91% of the peasantry. So here you have the situation in Ukraine whereby the working class is largely composed and comprised of ethnic minorities, Jews and Russians, and an overwhelmingly ethnic Ukrainian peasantry. So nationality, ethnicity, class, and class formation, these are interlocking experiences in Ukraine. And the national question is felt, deeply felt, at the point of production. So what the Bolsheviks do is to come in and say, it's class, not ethnicity. They counterpose class to ethnicity. But actually, ethnicity itself is a profoundly classed experience in this conjuncture. So what the Bolsheviks do in Ukraine is they carry out mass mobilization among the peasantry, among the working class, and the Red Army swells with tens of thousands of new recruits. And if these recruits simply declare that they will commit themselves to smashing the bourgeoisie, they are admitted without political screening. So this is a profoundly contentious social base on which to predicate a revolutionary project where race and class are so fused in this way. In other words, I guess what I tried to say in all of this is that anti-Semitism provided a conduit, a current for peasants, workers, and Red Army soldiers to move between the camps of counter-revolution and revolution. So Bolshevik power is vulnerable. The idea of Bolshevik power is vulnerable to an anti-Semitic interpretation in a social situation such as this. And that's why the slogan, to my mind at least, that's why the slogan, smash the Yids, long live Soviet power, can gain traction on the ground. Which brings me to the heart of the book, actually, and the fundamental question that I really agonized over and tried to grapple with. And that is, what on earth did the Bolsheviks do about this explosive situation? Again, not just what, but how. How did they come to terms with it, and who tried to tackle this ferocious and explosive issue? Well, in the literature, there's an assertion, generally speaking, that the Bolsheviks had a rigorous campaign against anti-Semitism and that it emanated from above. That is to say, it was led by the party leadership. And I went into the archives on this assumption, and I remember distinctly being handed the files in the archives on Lenin's personal files, and going through them, going through the inventory list, and not seeing the word anti-Semitism once. And this is this absolute terrifying moment as a PhD student, where you sit there and you think, is my PhD over? There's no project in this. It's game over. And I persevered, and I got some wonderful help, I should say, from the archivists in Rigaspi, Misha, the legendary Misha archivist in particular, who led me to other files, and I came away with a completely different perspective on this familiar story. That is to say, the Bolshevik or Soviet response to anti-Semitism in 1918 emanated from one single institution. This one, the Yevkom, the Yevreysky Commissariat, the Jewish Commissariat, the Soviet department of, the Jewish department of the Soviet government. Now, you will know, I'm sure, many in this audience, that the Bolshevik government had departments to deal with a whole range of political questions. There was the women's department, the Zhenotdel. There was a Muslim section of the party as well. And the Jewish Commissariat was part of this wider strategic approach by the Bolsheviks to address neglected questions of domination, oppression, and minority rights. And what's absolutely fascinating about this group of individuals is there was not a single Bolshevik among them. Who were they? They were left Zionists and Jewish socialists. And what I argue in the book is that these individuals played an absolutely crucial role, in fact, in some cases, the only role, in initiating a Soviet response to Red Army anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism more generally. To put the argument of the book in one sentence, there was a Soviet response to anti-Semitism, but it was not Bolshevik in origin. And if you look through the files of this organization, you see, for example, that they repeatedly wrote to the Bolshevik leadership demanding that something be done about the problem of anti-Semitism. This is Tzvi Friedland, a left Zionist who was the head of the Moscow Jewish Commissariat, who in 1918 wrote to Lenin himself and argued, the Jewish Commissariat has received information about pogroms, Red Army pogroms. The government must take measures to stop pogroms. We invite the Soviet government to do something about this. It is the task of the Russian socialist government. So you see the flow of anti-racist agency here, from the margins to the center. Friedland's assistant, Ilya Dabchovsky, also wrote to Lenin in April 1918. Comrade Lenin, the Soviet government must once and for all put an end to this. We ask you, respected comrade, to do something about this. And actually, these attempts were not met with immediate success. And it was in the face of inactivity from the Soviet government that these individuals took matters into their own hands and erected a whole series of campaigns against anti-Semitism. These are the individuals that put up the posters, write the pamphlets, organize reading groups, run adult education courses, go to factories, speak to workers, speak to peasants, speak to Red Army soldiers, and try to cultivate not just an anti-racist position, but an anti-racist praxis, an active campaign against the issue. And similar developments happened in the year following that, in 1919, when a group of Bundists, communist Bundists, moved into the Soviet government and helped cultivate a deepened and more sustained engagement with the question of anti-Semitism. Okay. Do I have time to do a couple more minutes, or are we? Three or four. Excellent. That's plenty. Okay. So what? What's significant about any of this? Why does it matter? Well, I think it matters. When you disaggregate the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism, what we find is that it was largely, not entirely, but largely the work of those Jewish revolutionaries who combined revolutionary agency with a self-identificatory Jewishness, whether it be Yiddish-inflected Bundism or a version of Marxist Zionism. That is to say, they engaged with the revolution as Jews. Now, before 1917, the Bolsheviks, and Lenin in particular, had a generally quite assimilationist position on the so-called Jewish question. That is to say, he saw Jewishness as a barrier to revolutionary consciousness. But after the coming to power, after October 1917, something profoundly different takes place. With the formation of the Jewish Commissariat and the Jewish sections of the party, suddenly Bolshevism permits the cultivation of a distinctly Soviet Jewish identity. And it's in that moment that a whole number of individuals find the Bolshevik project attractive. Individuals not like Trotsky or Zinoviev, who are not particularly well traversed down the path of assimilation, because most of these individuals have really quite active and sustained and deep connections to Yiddish-speaking cultural worlds and visions of Marxist Zionism. And despite the huge disagreements they had on these issues, these parties were nevertheless tied to different versions of Jewish national cultural projects. And it was out of that and through that that they led the campaign against anti-Semitism. And as Jack alluded to in his opening remarks, I tried to argue that there's something distinctive about this social formation of revolutionary activists. That is to say, the anti-racist praxis that we see coming out of these organizations is of a different quality to that emanates from the Bolshevik leadership. There's an urgency in how these activists address the question, an ethical imperative that drives their engagement with the question. As I said before, they engage with the revolution as Jews. And lest there be any confusion about this, the Bolsheviks have an anti-racist standpoint. They're opposed to anti-Semitism. But when it comes to the question of actualizing that standpoint, putting it into practice, as I've said, it relied on the agency of a group of individuals who were at the margins of the Bolshevik project, but at the heart of the Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, to borrow a phrase from Ken Moss. Now, I came back from the archives and showed all of this to my PhD supervisor, Professor Satnam Verdi at the University of Glasgow, who's a professor of racism studies. And he said, Brendan, I recognize this. The people you've encountered in the archive don't go around race to get to class. They go through race to get to class. And I think he's absolutely right about that. These individuals stretched Marxism, to paraphrase Frantz Fanon. They stretched Marxism, elevated the politics of ethnicity to an equal status to that of class. And as we know, the stretching only went so far, and many of them, most of them, were murdered in the nightmare of Stalinism when Marxism snapped back after having been stretched. So very quickly, who were they? Moishe Rafez, leader of the Communist Bund, the Kombund. Abraham Heifetz, also in the Bund. David Lipetz, who became Petrovsky, also of the Kombund. They received a Jewish education as children, and by their teens were immersed, totally immersed, in revolutionary politics. This was a generation born amidst the tumult of the 1881 pogroms and a real rupture in East European modern Jewish history. Unlike their parents and grandparents, they studied not in the yeshiva, but in universities abroad. And by the time they reach their teenage years in 1905 and early adulthood, they find themselves in the throes of revolution and anti-Semitic violence. So when the Bolsheviks come to power a decade later, the response to anti-Semitism has its moorings in these Jewish lives and the biographies through which they are lived out in the context of civil war. And this is not a Jewish story in many ways, not just a Jewish story. The route from national liberation through to communism was well trodden. I started this talk, as I start the book, with Claude McKay, the Jamaican-American poet of the Harlem Renaissance. McKay wrote in 1920, at this time, "Although an internationalist socialist, I believe that for subject peoples, nationalism is the open door through to communism." Just weeks after McKay wrote this, Abraham Merezhin, leader of the Jewish section of the Communist Party, himself a former Bundist, wrote, "The Jewish question was the door through which they came to us." He's talking about those Bundists like him who moved in to the Bolshevik project. So for McKay and for Merezhin, black and Jewish, the door that opened the way to communism, to the politics of the universal, was something profoundly particular, the experience of racialized violence. And I guess what I tried to finish the book with, and what I tried to say at the end of it, the takeaway for me at least, from thinking about this for what actually is 10 years now, is that anti-racist politics doesn't flow automatically from socialist politics. In the Russian Revolution, opposition to anti-Semitism had to be cultivated and renewed continually, often against great odds. So I suppose as we sit here, a century on, grappling with the damage done to the world by racism and anti-Semitism, I want to throw this out as a provocation. I wonder if the Russian Revolution still, as yet, may continue to have resources for us as we think through the emergency that we're in just now. And I'd love to hear what you think about that and maybe what people here think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan, for that brilliant presentation. Now you understand what he's doing here. We've asked each of the members of the panel to speak for up to 8 minutes. Be as disciplined as you can. We want to leave a lot of time for engaging with the audience. Andrew, you're on.
Sure. Well, I will, if I read what I have here, I would speak for way too long. So let me just say, first of all, thank you, Brendan, for the invitation to come and talk about your magnificent book. It's a true honor to be here. And it is really quite wonderful to see this book finally in print. I had the pleasure of reading this book as a dissertation and then in draft form, and to see the final version and to see how elegantly you bring together all of the various balls that are in the air and all of the complexities of the story, and how you really boil it down to the an extremely provocative and important argument. It's really an accomplishment, and you should be, I mean, thank you for sharing it with us. It's a book that really anyone who's interested in Soviet Jewish history should read, and anyone who's interested in Soviet history and the history of the revolution should read. And in fact, as I'm sitting here, as I was writing my comments, I was thinking that this is really a book that I wish had existed at the time that I started doing my own doctoral work. Because when I realize, you might not believe this because of my youthful good looks, but actually I'm a bit older than Brendan, and when I first began doing doctoral work in history, I came of age at a moment that was dominated by the social historical turn in Soviet history, the archival turn, following the opening of the archives in the early 90s. And I want to think about the book in a moment in that context, because really from reading from the historians who I worked with and who I read, people like Sheila Fitzpatrick, Diane Kenker, and on, really fantastic historians who were interested, who insisted, despite the fact of their enormous knowledge, there was a real centrality and a focus on the social categories. What mattered was the social. And the history was written through the social categories. And in some sense, questions of ethnicity and nationality for those historians were on the margins or were bracketed off. But curiously, the issue of anti-Semitism was always present in these works. And it was almost treated in a somewhat naturalized phenomenon that was sort of assumed to be there but never quite explained. And then even the historians who were working specifically on the question of nationality, Ron Suney comes to mind, Terry Martin, and a certain group of historians, the issue of nationality was front and center, yet the issue of Jews were not. And Jews were, in some sense, frequently left out of those stories. And although, again, in all of in those canonical works on Soviet nationality policy, Jews were always there in the form of anti-Semitism. So what you have done in this book is to take the question of anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience and in some sense place it at the very heart of the revolution itself and to really read the revolution through that moment. And you open up so many contradictions and so many contradictions within Bolshevik policy as a result. It's a true accomplishment, and it really is a testament. I know Brendan always insists he's a sociologist, but when you read the book and you look at the research that he's done and the way that he's mined the archives, he is what we historians affectionately call an archive rat in the best sense. It's really is a fantastic work of scholarship. And I could go on and on about this, but I will jump to the questions that I have about the book. So one of the questions I have is really, I would like you to actually reflect a little bit more on the use of the book. The book is so theoretically informed and it's in such a rich way, particularly by people like Claude McKay and Stuart Hall, who you didn't mention, Frantz Fanon. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on the relationship of Black authors and the way that they, in some sense, open up questions about the study of the Jewish experience, and particularly the experience in revolutionary politics. That's one broad question that I would be interested in hearing more about. Second, I think that there is an issue in the book that you point to quite clearly that in some sense, the Bolsheviks are walking a tightrope throughout this period. Because of the structural dynamics of the moment, there's really no way that they could have acted. And in fact, there's no way the revolution could have unfolded, it seems, that would not have produced an anti-Semitic moment. And so the question then becomes, you emphasize really the role of these Jewish socialists who are attempting to eradicate anti-Semitism or fight anti-Semitism effectively through rhetorical means. And so the question becomes, if anti-Semitism is a structural phenomenon, is there a way that this could ever have really been an effective policy? Is there a way that simply talking through the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and bringing it to light could have combated the phenomenon in and of itself? Or is in some sense, the revolution creates the necessity for the overcoming of anti-Semitism, but can't, in some sense, eradicate it from the outset. So, what's the relationship here between the necessity for structural reform and the absence of it in the moment of the revolution? Third, a sort of throwaway question that comes to mind. I'm interested. You obviously write quite a bit about the Bund, the Kommunbund, the Social Zionists, but you also write quite a bit about the Yevsektia. And the Yevsektia, for those of you who know the history of the revolution, very rarely comes across in very good light. It's usually seen as enemy number one from the standpoint of a lot of Jewish historiography or historiography about the Jewish experience. So I'm wondering how your work makes us rethink the experience of the Yevsektia. And then finally, here, I love the book, but there's one issue that I really always want to argue about, and so I'll throw it out there, which is the issue of the non-Jewish Jews, if you will, which you stay away from in the book, but the Jewish Bolsheviks and their response to anti-Semitism. And obviously, what you do in the book is you show very convincingly the incredibly important role of the Jewish socialists, the ones from Poale Zion, from the Bund, et cetera, and so forth. And yet, the Jews who are seen as being inactive are the canonical Bolsheviks, Zinoviev, Trotsky above all. And yet, I wonder to what degree this is a fair characterization, because as you point out in the book, Zinoviev is going around giving multiple lectures against anti-Semitism at one point. And then there's the figure of Trotsky. And as you sort of point out in the book, the Bolsheviks are operating in this milieu where there's not simply the dynamics on the ground, but there is the overarching narrative that Bolshevism itself is a Jewish plot, and that it's a Jewish conspiracy. And so Trotsky, being the head of the Red Army, second in command of the revolution at the time, could he really have positioned himself as a spokesman against anti-Semitism in a moment where the revolution was understood to be a Jewish conspiracy, and would that have been an effective policy? And what I can't help noticing in the book is that the two figures who you point to as Bolsheviks who are denouncing anti-Semitism everywhere, or very frequently, are Yevgeny Preobrazhensky and Christian Rakovsky, both of whom are the two closest associates of Trotsky in the Bolshevik Party. So is it possible that, in fact, they are serving as, in some sense, proxies for the Jewish Bolsheviks who may be acting as Jewish socialists also in the best way that they can?
Wow. Woo!
Those are some easy questions.
Yeah.
I left the hard ones on the floor.
I think that, Brendan, what's likely to work best is if we allow everyone to pose questions, and then I'm going to turn it back to you. So Brendan gets the last word tonight. Polly, if you would.
Okay, well, you're lucky I don't have questions. Actually, I have comments. So shall I still offer them?
Thank you, Polly.
Yeah, my mic is on. Okay, can you all hear me? Great. What I said was you're very lucky because I don't have questions. I have comments and praise and description. So I'll proceed with that. Like Andrew, I learned a great deal from your reading your book, and I'm so glad to have this chance to comment on it in this forum. So I have 3 comments in the main. The first one is I just wanted to give my perspective on what I see as the real originality of this book, particularly in the framework of Russian Jewish historiography and historiography of Soviet Jews at this moment of transition and origin. That's the first thing. The second is I'd like to highlight what I think is a really masterful presentation of what you referred to as the tightrope that Bolsheviks walk. I'm going to refer to it as the unresolved Bolshevik dilemma regarding Jews. And that's the second. The third is I'd like to reflect broadly on how I read the kind of story of the revolution as you present it, this reading through the lens of anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience. How does this revolution appear, the meta-narrative of the revolution, okay? So let me speak to the first point. Brendan, your book allows us to rethink the history of the Soviet Jewish experience and encounter. And what I think that you do that's especially innovative is that you manage to integrate 3 sets of historical literature. You deal with the Civil War pogroms, which has been long overlooked and is now resurfacing as a topic deserving of study in its own right. You deal with the relationship between Soviets and Jews as an encounter, which I think is very important as a kind of framework, right? This is something that particularly interested like the revisionists, the turn of revisionism among historians of Soviet Jewry beginning in the late 1990s, so you address that as well. And then this third set of literature is, what you incorporate is you bring the thunder from sociology to this whole question. You examine anti-Semitism as a form of racism and as a form of racism on the left, and a form of racism to which the left had to respond, in this case, within the context of revolutionary Bolshevism, okay? So I want to speak more in depth why I think this notion of the Soviet-Jewish encounter is very important. What you show in this book is Jews, your subject is anti-Semitism, and yet you present Jews as more than victims of anti-Semitism. They brought their own agendas to the Soviet experiment. And you detail their achievements, the political activity they engaged in, the responses to Red Army pogroms, their abilities to use their skills as Yiddish writers to that effect. And although the project was halted by the party and the state, they managed to regroup again and again in 1918 and 1919, even joining a Soviet government in spite of the fact that they knew they themselves would face anti-Semitism there. And some of the phrases that you use, I think that are beautifully written. The socialism of these Jews, you write, was, quote, at once revolutionary, proletarian, and Yiddish, and profoundly inflected by the actuality of anti-Semitism, okay? That really captures the complexity of it. This, continues Brendan, was the Soviet Jewish encounter, a meeting between a layer of radicalized Jewish revolutionaries and a nascent Bolshevik government that afforded unprecedented scope for ethnic minority political mobilization at the level of the state, okay? And again, you point out the irony of this again and again. Jews supported the Bolsheviks, even knowing they faced anti-Semitism in its ranks. And what choice did they really have? And this quote you bring from Vladimir Mikhailovsky, this is 1922, even rabbis realized it was better for Jews to lose their faith than their lives. Okay, putting the choice rather starkly. So again, this notion of this Soviet Jewish political project, the encounter, this strikes me as being one of the more, perhaps most important contributions of this book. My second comment is that, that regarding the so-called unresolved Bolshevik dilemma. And that, simply put, is the base from which the Bolsheviks drew their support had anti-Semitic elements. There were anti-Semitic peasants and anti-Semitic workers. And they appealed to that, right? Of course, they labeled anti-Semitism as counter-revolutionary, but they realized that anti-bourgeois sentiment provided a reservoir of revolutionary socialism. These are your words. It was a mobilizing force. Jews could be easily equated with capitalists, and the Bolsheviks knew that. And yet, adding to the dilemma, in order to defend their revolutionary gains, the Bolsheviks had to stridently oppose anti-Semitism, rhetorically, right? And they continued to pass resolutions that combating anti-Semitism, even as the Red Army was committing pogroms. You know, June 1917, the first Congress of Soviets passed a resolution to combat anti-Semitism. The second Congress of Soviets, October 1917, reiterating, revolutionary honor means no pogroms. To be against the Jews is to be for the Tsar. This was their formulation. And then, to add another piece to the dilemma that they would never be able to resolve, the Bolsheviks understood that among their enemies, the whites, Soviet power itself was associated with Jews. And this is the so-called Judeo-communism myth and construction. And they had no control over that. Absolutely. Right? In response, the Bolsheviks sought to sever their association between Jews and Soviet power. And one of the most, for me, mind-blowing things you write about is in late 1919, Lenin quietly issues this order to reduce the number of Jews in government, okay? Quota, right? 1919, keep a tight rein on the Jews, he says, transfer them to the front, transfer them into the Red Army, reduce their visibility in the party and the state. And what was he really trying to do? You argue he believed it would be easier to fight anti-Semitism if the allegation that there were too many Jews in government could be, disproven. And of course, in acknowledging that perception, they simply perpetuated the stereotype and the myth that they sought to critique and dismantle. And so again, this dilemma, the Bolsheviks, I don't believe, managed to resolve, and that you are able to present it in its full complexity, I think, is really an achievement. Okay, third, what is the story of the revolution in this book? What is the revolutionary story when told from the perspective of anti-Semitism? And here I want to single out a passage from your chapter about the Committee for the Struggle Against Anti-Semitism. This is in 1919, operated by the Yivsektia. And as you show, this was the most promising and productive of all the initiatives that the non-Bolshevik Jews waged to try to fight anti-Semitism. And it was dismantled within 6 months of its founding. right? And you trace this through your diligent archival research. Why was it dismantled? So this is a very revealing quote you give from, this is the Commissariat for Enlightenment's justification for closing the committee. They claim the committee was a stillborn project, as evidenced by its own productivity, a stillborn project. And clearly that was disingenuous because the committee was anything but unproductive, right? But why would they make this claim? The project to combat anti-Semitism, they claimed, was dead on arrival, right? This term, stillborn. So why would they make this claim? And I think you make the argument that the Bolsheviks wanted to claim the problem simply no longer existed. The need to combat anti-Semitism no longer existed because anti-Semitism itself had been solved by the revolution. It was a relic of the past, they claimed, and the new order had ushered in a clean slate, right? Freeing the world from all these different forms of strife. Freedom from religion, freedom from nationality, freedom from gender, right? And all of the attendant problems. And so I think this notion of the stillborn revolution is very interesting. And many other Jewish writers referred to the revolution in this way. This is something that the Harriet Marav, literary scholar, has written about. So for example, Isaac Babel referred to the revolution in this way. He was, when he was living in Petrograd in 1918, he wrote nonfiction about what the city was like during revolutionary times. One of the places he visited was a maternity ward. And there he saw women giving birth to babies who were underdeveloped and malnourished. I mean, this was, starvation, right? Some of them were stillborn. And for him, the women and the babies were symbols of revolution. The Bolsheviks had promised a new world, liberated from the past. But what actually emerged? The destruction of the past, and then a failure to produce something new. Okay? The world that they promised that would emerge from the ashes of the old failed to materialize. It was dead on arrival. The Bolsheviks, one of the tragedies of the Bolsheviks is they denied that this was the case. They denied the reality and kept on claiming the problems of the past had been solved and no longer existed. The problems of women, the problems of Jews, the problems of the quote-unquote kulak. All of it had been swept away. And this denial of reality, the struggle to force them to struggle, right, to make reality conform with their vision, whatever the cost, whatever the human cost. And I think that by reading the revolution in this way, you locate the kind of origin of the revolution as a moment in the beginning of what will be the Soviet experience. Mm-hmm. And it will plague the Soviet experiment for the next 70 years. So again, this is a real accomplishment, and I'm so pleased to be able to comment on it, as I said, and thank you. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Polly. Wow. Thank you.
Last, not least, Jonathan.
So I want to pick up a little bit on what the other speakers have noted and what Brendan was pointing out many times, which is the paradoxical nature of the revolutionary moment. I would say the tragic nature of the revolutionary moment. The moment in which everything that is not. The moment in which good and bad are no longer real moral categories. And the tumult and the whirlpool, the moral ambiguity of this for everyone involved. And a couple of things struck me in listening to you speak, and I have to be open with everyone. I have not had time to read your book yet. But in listening to your comments, which are extremely stimulating, I wanted to ask a couple of additional questions. One is, the first that struck me is whether it is really possible to talk about anti-Semitism in the revolutionary moment without reference to the pre-revolutionary experience of it, without reference to the Baylis trial of 1913, without reference even going back farther, which some people see as the origin of Judah Comuna in the Dreyfus trial and the origin of modern anti-Semitism. And I want to pick up on what Polly was saying about the way the Bolsheviks were trapped by the anti-Semitic reality that they faced, particularly in Ukraine. I would be interested to know whether that reality existed elsewhere in Russia, in the army, for instance, that was fighting in the eastern part of the country. And what I wanted to think about was this. When the whites come into Ukraine, one of their strategies for rallying the Ukrainian peasants is to say that the Bolsheviks are Jews and the Jews are Bolsheviks, and you kill one, you kill another. And in other words, they're playing on the indigenous anti-Semitism, or what they perceive to be the indigenous endemic anti-Semitism of the people. When the Reds come in, they have to galvanize the Ukrainian peasantry. As you pointed out, 90% of the population is peasant. They have to get the peasantry on their side. And so when Isaac Babel is with the Red Cavalry in 1920, he writes that what he is witnessing is not a revolution at all. It's a Cossack uprising. And one of the things that is inherent in so much of Cossack tradition is anti-Semitism, the Black Hundreds, and all of that. So the Bolsheviks are put, as you rightly point out, in this paradoxical situation, which is, how do they get these people on their side? They have to give them some free rein. And at the same time, they have an ideology that militates against this. And so you have someone like Isaac Babel, who is a true believer. He is a real believer in communism, in absolute despair over what he sees as the ruination of everything that he believes, and yet fighting a fight which, if they don't win it, will mean the destruction of everything he believes as well. It's an impossible situation. So this is one thing I'd like to think about a little bit more, which is how it's possible to sort of take the anti-Semitism of the revolutionary period out of the more general picture of the pre-war situation, which of course is exacerbated and brought into a fury by World War I, in which the Jews are accused of being a fifth column on all sides. And there's no winning. The other thing that I'm curious to hear you talk about a little bit more, is the relationship between ideology and belief structure. Because, and I may be wrong because, again, I haven't read your whole book, but it seemed to me the way you were presenting it in your talk, the real problem for the Bolsheviks was an ideological problem. And the problem for the Soviet people was an ideological one. That is a question of a political stance, of class ideology and so forth. And for at least the peasants, the Cossacks, that Isaac Babel describes, it's at a level far below ideology. In fact, in one of his stories, the Cossacks get word that Trotsky is insisting that they give this white sympathizer a trial. And they say, to hell with Trotsky. We're going to give him real justice. And so it's all up for grabs. And were these people really being motivated by ideology that they didn't even understand? That is to say, the ordinary soldier. Or were they being motivated by a revolutionary situation that essentially is like every revolutionary situation? What do people do when the lights go out, when there is a hurricane? The first thing you see on television is they go out of their houses and they smash windows and they steal things, and there's violence because the structures of law and order have been destroyed. And so in Ukraine, especially, all the structures of civil society had been destroyed, first by World War I, and now by a revolution that is taking shape in their world on multiple sides. It's the Bolsheviks, it's the whites, it's the Ukrainian nationalists, it's Petlura and the ultranationalists. And so I think from a moral standpoint, or even if you want to think of it as a psychological standpoint, so many of the people were really completely unmoored. And when that happens, the worst always comes to the fore. And the worst here were the feelings of revenge against the Jews. In one of his stories, one of his last stories in the Red Cavalry, Babel, or Lutov, is taken by his horse into a field. He's asleep. He's tied his leg to a rein, and the horse drags him. And when he wakes up, there's a Ukrainian peasant standing over him. And at first you think, well, maybe the Ukrainian peasant is going to shoot him or something. But he's a nice guy. And he doesn't recognize that this guy is a Jew. And they're talking. And he says to him, you know, how many Jews are there in the world? And Lutov says, well, there are about 10 million. The peasant, this is 1920. The peasant says to him, when all of this is finished, there'll be about 200,000 left. This is not ideology, from my point of view, I don't think. This is some feeling of the angst of this world. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about how you sort of look at that larger, that larger picture.
Great. Okay. Wow. Thank you, Jonathan. We already have a great deal to talk about, but I am going to add one comment, and only one, and then, Brendan, we're going to ask for your response. There's a catchphrase, which at one time was very famous, very widely known, and that was, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. But it's very telling in this context that that's not a catchphrase that originated in Russia or Ukraine. It's a catchphrase that originated in Germany, and it's not a catchphrase that originated in the era of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's a catchphrase that originated in the latter half of the 19th century. And it was something that was widely debated and discussed in the context of what was at that time the largest Marxist-oriented socialist party in the world, which was the German Social Democratic Party. Now, the reason that I'm raising it at this moment is because it seems to me that one of the underlying dynamics that you're interested in revolves precisely about the relationship between anti-Semitism and socialism, and the ways in which it's a misunderstanding of socialism to use anti-Semitism and the ways in which, nevertheless, some socialists did make use of it. And the point that I would like to hear you address is whether we're really dealing here with a phenomenon that goes much wider and deeper than the Russian experience to the relationship between leftism and socialism broadly considered. I'll leave it at that. Brendan, if you would, you have been posed many, many profound questions by the other people on this panel, and I would love to hear your responses.
Are we going to
We are going to take questions from the audience after you have responded to these.
I don't have enough here, so I think we need wow, this is the first book I've ever written, and it's the first book launch I've ever done. And I'm kind of blown away by the whole thing, to be honest. I'm blown away at the warmth and generosity of the people on this platform. I remember when I did my PhD Viva, I was really nervous before I went in, and my supervisor said to me, look, this is a really special thing that you're going to experience. It's going to be stressful, but you're going to get to sit with a committee of 3 or 4 people who you respect deeply, and you're going to get to listen to them talk about your work. That will not happen again in your academic career. This is a really special moment. And this feels like a repetition in many ways. Really, it does. It is daunting, but it's also a tremendous privilege to be able to tackle these amazingly interesting and really difficult questions. I think I've got 13 written down here. Let's see how we go. So, Andrew has identified something that was really important to the dissertation and the book, but it's not necessarily readily apparent if you read it, which is to say that this is a work of sociology, of historical sociology, and the dissertation is completely overdetermined by social theory. And when I spoke to Cambridge University Press, their gentle suggestion was, get rid of all of that. And I understand why they said it, because they didn't want it to just be of interest to 23 sociologists that are interested in Gramsci and Althusser and critical theory, which is what really drove the project. That was the apparatus, right? That was the theoretical frame. So, but I'm delighted that it's still traceable just about from Polly and Andrew's comments. That's their sense. And one thing that Andrew picked up was this sociology of racism, which is absolutely the way that, in my mind at least, this issue can be located. And I appreciate that's a strange move to make. But I think of anti-Semitism as a form of racialization. That is to say, the race-making process. The process is the historical, social, and cultural processes through which, by which, particular social collectivities come to be seen as belonging to races. And if you situate anti-Semitism in that theoretical concept, it opens up a set of history that allows you to draw out the very real connections between anti-Jewish, anti-black, anti-Muslim racializations across time and space that work in different ways. They're dissimilar, but they're not unconnected either. And, you know, as an undergraduate, I'd been steeped in British sociology of racism studies. This was Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, and these were sociologists that tried to grapple with the race-class relationship. And I just couldn't believe this. When I went into the archives, what I found was that the same dilemmas that they were grappling with in British politics in the 1970s were being played out in the radically different situation of revolutionary Russia, which is to say, how do you understand the relationship between race and class? How do you respond to race and racism when it presents itself within the working class? Do you do so with a class-wide, universal project, or do you respond to it through racial formation, which is to say, you respond to it as Jews, not as workers? That stuff was being debated long before British sociologists turned their minds to the issue in revolutionary Russia. So not everyone has to see the connections in the way I do, but I'm just explaining that was my thinking going into this work. Andrew also picked up on the Yevsektia, and this is one of the provocations of the book, implicit, though Andrew's helpfully made it explicit, is that, you know, they're not the enemy, as far as I'm concerned. The Jewish Commissariat, the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, in many ways are kind of the heroes of the story. Here are these individuals grappling with ferocious anti-Semitic violence from all sides, and they try to do something about it. I can't not but be impressed by that. And they're the ones that sustain and keep alive a socialist, communist opposition to anti-Semitism. They cultivate it at the level of praxis. There's a huge difference between saying you're against anti-Semitism and doing something about it when the issue's in your own front garden. And they're the ones that did something about it. And that is a provocation within the literature. You're absolutely right, because the Yevsektia have been written off as, well, as the enemy, as it were. And they're more than victims as well. And they're much more than heroes. And actually, at the end of the book, the last chapter, and I didn't talk about this at all, what we find is that the Yevsektia themselves actually reproduce some of the most crude and deeply racialized anti-Semitic stereotypes as they are trying to reconstruct Soviet Jewry. So they're complicated people. They're responding to anti-Semitism and acquiescing to it at the same time. Who do you think said this? The Jews have the peasants by the throat. They provoke and irritate the non-Jewish population. That's why we have pogroms. That's one of the Yevsektia activists that responds to anti-Semitism. He says that in a Jewish context, not in a Russian-speaking context, and that's absolutely vital. What they say to Lenin, what they say to the Russian working class is one thing. What they say among themselves when they're grappling with this stuff can often be quite different. All three of the respondents have absolutely picked out something I did not make explicit in my comments, which is that the Bolsheviks have no way out. They are trapped, I think was one phrase. There's a tightrope. They are in a bind whereby any step taken on the so-called Jewish question risks perpetuating the politics of anti-Semitism. And they are deeply, deeply aware of that. In fact, they agonize over this issue. Just to give one example, the work of Oleg Budnitsky really brings this out brilliantly. Budnitsky shows that the left Zionists write to the Bolsheviks and say, we want Jewish-only battalions in the Red Army. Why do we want these battalions? Because we experience so much anti-Semitism in the Red Army, we want our own Jewish units. The Bolsheviks completely agonize over this. Okay, if we have Jewish units, will there be more anti-Semitism? Yes, because it shows that it proves the Jewish Bolshevik construct. On the other hand, if we have Jews on the front, then it will disprove the Jewish Bolshevik construct, and it will disprove the notion that Jews won't fight. So they go back and forth. Trotsky himself changes his mind on the issue. There's no way out. And I think the three speakers have really brought that out and reminded me that that's absolutely the dilemma of the situation that they are in. But could they have done things differently? Well, here I think praxis is important. The individuals that do the work of making the jump from standpoint to actuality are not Trotsky, and are not even Preobrazhensky, actually, and not Zinoviev. Zinoviev does it for about a week in April 1918, but the rest of them live their lives through this, and that's the qualitative distinction I think we need to make between the anti-racist Bolshevik that says something about it and those that carry out, kind of cultivate an anti-racist, anti-Semitic politics day in and day out, and that's why I think the distinction is important. What else can I say? Okay, Polly, I'm going to try and turn to your comments now. Just to say that the notion of the Soviet-Jewish encounter, that phrase is Elissa Bemperard's formulation, actually, and she's got a really wonderful book coming out on this topic soon. I don't know if she's in here tonight. No, okay. One thing I would perhaps respond to would be the notion that the Bolsheviks knew that their message would mobilize workers, mobilize peasants, and generate anti-Semitism at the same time, and that they played to this. I'm not sure if the Bolsheviks played to it. I think they were agonized by it. I'm not sure if they instrumentally went with it. Some Bolsheviks on the ground may have done that, and I think there are parts in the book where I suggest that, but I think the leadership is trying to constantly take the sting out of anti-Semitism, and that's exactly what I think Lenin is trying to do in that explosive statement that you quoted I think his raison d'etre is not to get Jews out of power. His raison d'etre is to stop this murderous anti-Semitism that actually threatens to destroy the entire revolution. So I think he tries to take the sting out of it with one hand and actually acquiesces to the very anti-Semitic construct itself in the other. I absolutely love what you've done with this throwaway statement, which is just, I did nothing with this, by the way, the statement of the revolution as stillborn, of the campaign against anti-Semitism as stillborn. I quote this and leave it on the page. Polly, you've taken it somewhere profound and posed a whole set of questions about how we understand the revolution as a whole with just this one archival document that I didn't know what to do with. So really, thank you for that. Jonathan, you had big questions too. In the book, the first chapter sets the scene in the late imperial context. I don't think it does any justice, but it tries to do what you absolutely rightly laid your finger on, which is this cannot be understood outside of the pre-revolutionary anti-Semitic moment and series of moments. I tried to address it. Whether I do so enough, I'm not so sure. Is it unique to Ukraine? Yes and no. So the particular force that this anti-Semitism takes is unique in the Ukrainian context because of the absence of political power, because of the breakdown of any semblance of political power. But the stereotypes, the representations of Jewishness carry across the whole empire. They just don't have the same consequences as they have in Ukraine. So some of these representations of Jewishness you find in the Red Army in parts of the Far East where there are no, or comparatively fewer, Jews, but it does not have the same political consequences as it has in Ukraine. Here I think we might have a slight disagreement around ideology and belief and structure. See, sociology is important because that's actually always what this comes back to. What is the place of ideology within political movements? So you asked the question, is this ideology or is this the revolutionary situation, the breakdown of power? And to me, it's both, and it has to be both. That is to say, ideas matter. Ideas matter in people's lives. Ideas structure the way we feel, the way we think, the way we see, the way we imagine ourselves, the belongings, the networks, the forms of inclusion and exclusion that animate our lives and our relationships with each other, regardless of where we find ourselves. And what Bolshevism and various other competing projects do is it tries to breathe life into those ideas and turn it in a political direction. And that's what 1917 looks and feels like. And Mark Steinberg's in the work, and it is in this room. And Mark's work really shows in that Voices of Revolution book just how ideas take on meanings. Ideology takes on meaning on the ground, but is shifted on the ground when it's brought into political life from below. And that is the issue, it seems to me. It's not ideology present or absent. Ideology is present, but it's messy. It's really, really messy. The Bolshevik message means something on the ground, but means something different on the ground. In the Pale, in Petrograd, in Moscow, these ideas are taken up within social struggles and are shifted and changed in the course of revolutionary struggle. So I think the task that we have to do is to trace the role that ideology plays and trace the way it's changed when it's brought into social conflict from below. And what we see is that the Bolshevik message does mean something on the ground, and it's taken up and it's changed and in some context turned in an anti-Semitic direction. So I don't think it's ideology or mob. I think it's ideology and breakdown of social power. And that's in a situation like Ukraine, where we've had the pre-revolutionary cultivation of anti-Semitism, as you rightly described, it proves to be an absolutely explosive force. And Jack's final comment about, well, this all speaks to a much wider history, I couldn't agree more. None of this is unique to revolutionary Russia. It plays out in unique ways in revolutionary Russia, but the question of anti-Semitism on the left is one that we're living with right now. And in that respect, I hope that the book offers something to people today who are trying to grapple with that in the here and now. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take some questions from the audience. The hour is late, but there are microphones that are going to be brought around. Please raise your hands if you have questions.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned how we're all surrounded by anti-Semitism. It's on the right, it's on the left. It seems to be all around us, no matter what century we're in, there's anti-Semitism, and it's not just unique to this story, which makes it all the harder to deal with and to solve that problem if it's always there. My question was to the author, was class really the main fuel of the anti-Semitism, that Jews had the power, that they had the money, that they were controlling everything, more so than religious anti-Semitism with what the belief was what Jews did to Christ, or racism as Jews being another race? Was it really class and this perception that Jews were controlling everything with power that fueled the anti-Semitism with the Bolsheviks more than anything else?
Go ahead. How do you want to play this?
Respond if you would.
Okay, and just to say, I mean, we're sitting here with people on a panel who could answer all of this absolutely much better than I could. So you asked the question to me, and it's a great question, but I'm really conscious that other people could really answer this as well.
No, please.
But, okay. So you're absolutely right. There are, I mean, I think Adorno and Horkheimer of the critical theorists are helpful here with this formulation of the elements of anti-Semitism. And there are elements of anti-Semitism in late imperial and revolutionary Russia. I identified one, I drew out one, and tried to play with it and work with it in my introductory comments. But you're absolutely right to pull it back down and to situate it within that wider set of elements. And religion clearly is one. And the relationship between religion and state in late imperial Russia plays such a crucial role, again, in cultivating anti-Semitic sentiment. But one thing that pops into my head as you were asking the question is the universal, the statement, the universal by Grigoriev, who's the leader of this bandit leader, who becomes leader of the Soviet 6th Army in Ukraine. And he issues this declaration that says, holy toilers, so right away it's religion and class, holy toilers, you've been deceived by a people more powerful than you. Holy toilers with, what's the phrase when you get these rough bits on your hands?
Calluses.
Calluses. Holy toilers with calluses on your hands. The Christ-hating Muscovites have deceived you and are taking over this country. So it's non-referential anti-Semitism. His audience knows exactly what he's talking about. But it's class, it's power, it's religion, it's the elements of anti-Semitism, and that's why it has such force. So you're right to bring it back down. But class is part of that.
Brendan, first, I want to thank you so much for your book and from what I heard from you. I'm from the Soviet Union. I learned so much new things from you, unbelievable. So here is my question. Considering, as Polly said, that's a horrible 80 years bloody experiment with the revolution and socialism, and millions of people run away the moment door is open. My question is, what's the parallel with today's situation in UK and in US, and what can we learn to do or not to do to, I don't know, to prevent, to make it better, to not to happen in this great country all these horrible things like revolution and socialism. So what can we learn from your book?
I'm sorry, I must apologize. I know we spoke before, but I can't recall your name. So I just should say, by way of introduction, I spoke with Ina's grandson yesterday evening in Delaware, who asked just as interesting and difficult a question as that one. So, and I'm not sure I'm able to answer it either, like I was last night. So there are parallels to draw in terms of anti-Semitism and the left. There is, my colleague David Feldman at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism has suggested that we should rethink anti-Semitism, rethink the metaphors that we use to describe anti-Semitism. On the left today, anti-Semitism is described as a virus. Jeremy Corbyn reaches for this metaphor. It's a virus. It latches on from the fringes. And David Feldman's suggestion is that we should rethink anti-Semitism as a reservoir, as a pool of ideas that sits within the political culture, ideas that are there to be drawn upon whenever Jews become the subject of debate, as is happening right now. So if we work with a metaphor such as that, I think we can be better placed to draw out the clear distinctions. Brexit Britain is not revolutionary Russia. Nevertheless, some of the anti-Semitic stereotypes have endured across time and across space. So there are some parallels to be drawn within the elements of anti-Semitism. In terms of revolution, here we might have a different entry point into the subject. I'm not against revolution. So there's a fundamental difference right there. It sounds like we're both against anti-Semitism, but I'm not against revolution. I would like a revolution that was not anti-Semitic.
Thank you very much. You spoke about that wonderful moment of recognition in the archive when you saw that questions that Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy had posed were questions that were quite active 100 years earlier.
Right.
And in looking at Gilroy and Hall's work, we can think about the questions that they posed about finding allies for what was then termed in the 70s the Black experience, and also the questions that they raised about the nature of empire and racism in the wake of dissolving empires. How did you see those questions playing out at the time of the Russian Revolution, particularly in 1919?
I wish you'd asked me that question 5 years ago. I could have thought about it before writing the book. It's a terrific question. I never made the connection between Gilroy and Hall's engagement with empire and, say, Russian Jewry's engagement with empire. I think they're two very different. I mean, this is one illustration of where the comparison falls away, I think, and I'm making this up on the spot. I don't think that those two engagements with empire map on easily onto each other. But one thing that does leap off the page to me with Stuart Hall came up with this wonderful formulation when he was working with Gramsci's ideas. And by the way, this book is completely Gramscian. At least the dissertation is completely Gramscian, but you wouldn't realize that now from reading it. I stripped it all away. But one thing that Hall said when he was trying to think about race with Gramsci, he said, race is the modality in which class is lived. And I took that, it jumped off the page to me, and I took that and I thought, hang on a minute, for these Yevsektia activists, anti-Semitism is the modality in which the revolution is lived. They cannot stand outside of anti-Semitism. It is the driving force of life and death, and in the case of these Kombundists, it's part of the story of what drives them into the arms of the Bolsheviks. So Hall helped me to understand the life choices that those Yevsektia and Kombundist activists made.
Ladies and gentlemen, the hour is late. Please allow me to thank Andrew and Polly and Jonathan and all of you, and above all, our guest tonight.
And thank you, really,
Brendan
thank you
McGee.
so much. And thank you to each of you.
I just want to add, as we walk out, that we have a few copies of the book for sale if you're interested in reading the whole thing. And join us in the lobby.